Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the webinar. While it's morning here in Singapore and Japan, we would also like to extend a warm welcome to you if you're joining us from elsewhere around the globe. Thank you for joining us for the opening session of the workshop on enhancing responsible business in Southeast Asia. This webinar series is jointly organized by the ISEAS-SPF Institute and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. First, before we begin, please allow me to share some housekeeping issues. The Chatham House rule applies to this webinar. To post questions, please use the Q&A function. Do identify yourself. Please share your name and institutional affiliation. To raise any technical problems, please use the chat function. Thank you for your cooperation. To start, may I now invite Mr. Choi Shing Kwok, Director of the ISEAS-SPF Institute, to deliver his welcoming remarks. Mr. Choi, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to everyone from Singapore. I am very happy to be here with my colleague, Dr. Atsushi Tsunami, President of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, to welcome all of you to this webinar series on the topic Enhancing Responsible Business in Southeast Asia. This series provides us with an opportunity to examine the impact of business activities in Southeast Asia and to highlight the ways that governments, businesses, and other stakeholders can promote responsible business practices in normal times, during a crisis like what we are in now in COVID-19, and also in our post-COVID future. Developing clear and practical solutions that can benefit disadvantaged individuals, societies and communities, as well as the environment, helps us to pave the way for a healthy business environment that will in turn lead to sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Over the last few years, Southeast Asia was already experiencing challenging times in navigating difficult domestic conditions, major geopolitical shifts, and international trade tensions, as I'm sure other regions are as well. These developments contributed to the uncertain outlook that hampered the ongoing growth and stability in Southeast Asia, as it did for many other parts of the world. That outlook is now further compounded by the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. After a period in which attention was focused primarily on controlling the spread, saving the lives of the vulnerable, and preventing the healthcare systems from being overwhelmed, it is clear that the disruption to livelihoods, enterprises, and economies will present the region problems that are just as serious, if not more so, than the healthcare crisis. Among other things, unemployment has soared, daily necessities have been harder to come by for the poor and those especially in the informal sector. Industries like tourism and aviation have collapsed due to lower demand, and supply chains are being disrupted and reorientated. The implications are enormous and will only fully come to light when the government relief measures that have cushioned the impact so far are withdrawn. What is already clear and very pertinent to the topics of our discussion today is that the pandemic has magnified the existing inequalities in society and disrupted the region's development prospects. Here in Singapore, we are fortunate to have the resources and capacity to deal with the challenges. Nevertheless, we are facing our worst recession since our independence in 1965. The GDP growth will likely contract by between 5 to 7% this year. The government has acted with a massive stimulus package to save jobs, provide employment support to workers, and make credit available to companies to tide over the immediate period. Things will stay fluid for some time, but over the next few years, as we move into a post-COVID future, Singapore will need to transform the economy while retraining workers to thrive in that new post-COVID world. As demand patterns, supply chains, and workforce conditions change, new sources of growth will have to be found, as some old paradigms will not come back even after the pandemic recedes. In addition to strengthening social safety nets, Singapore will also be making a major push towards enhancing sustainability as part of the recovery plan. As it does so, it also hopes to advance green financing and sustainable development across the region so that it can help facilitate the region's growth while also protecting the environment better. Our central bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, has implemented a series of measures, including proposing guidelines to integrate ESG criteria for banks, issuers of securities, and asset managers that work in the region. By devoting attention to sustainable development, Singapore hopes to build back better from this crisis and create a brighter future for the people, the economies, and the societies across our region. A few words about this series of webinars. We are fortunate to have an illustrious group of international and regional experts, scholars, and practitioners to share and discuss topics on responsible business today, as well as over the next 5 weeks. I want to thank all our speakers and panelists who have committed their time to join us for these webinars. I would also like to say a big thank you to our partner, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, for co-organizing this event with us. Their partnership with us reflects Japan's deep and enduring relationship with Singapore and also with Southeast Asia. I also look forward to our future activities together to further our joint interests to develop solutions for the varied problems and challenges confronting Southeast Asia. Finally, I would like to wish everyone very fruitful learning in today's webinar, as well as in the weeks ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. And now, may I invite Dr. Atsushi Tsunami, President of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, to deliver his opening remarks. Dr. Tsunami, please.
笹川平和財団の津波でございます。
This is Sunami of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I hope I'm now connected. And first of all, apologies for having kept you waiting. I've kept you waiting, but my remarks will be rather short as welcoming remarks, but I look forward to the discussion later on. Ladies and gentlemen who are participating in this seminar, panelists and speakers, thank you very much for joining this webinar. And Mr. Choi, much appreciation for your opening remarks. Our foundation concluded a memorandum of understanding with ISEAS-SPF Institute, which is one of the most renowned think tanks in Southeast Asia, in November 2018. Ever since, we've been strengthening our collaboration. And as part of our Asia Impact Dialogue project, we are most honored that we have been given the opportunity to co-organize this webinar series with ISEAS-SPF Institute. The Asia Impact Dialogue was launched under the strong support of our previous president, Mr. Ono. We're into our third year. Mr. Ono, our previous president, was heartbroken that opportunities for intellectual exchange and dialogue between Japan and Asian countries are being lost. and came up with the idea to launch a project focusing on dialogue from a new perspective, positioning Japan as the most advanced nation in terms of facing challenges that others would eventually experience. The objective was to repeat dialogue with experts, civil society, and policymakers on common societal challenges between Japan and Asia, and to contribute to the strengthening of partnership between Japan and Asian countries. The SPF has taken over this spirit, and we intend to continue various activities. The commemorative inaugural workshop was held in February 2018, co-organized with ISEAS-SPF Institute, and the theme chosen for that occasion was Aging in Asia, and this workshop was held in Singapore. The theme we've chosen this time around is enhancing responsible business in Southeast Asia. Over the coming 6 weeks, a variety of issues will be taken up, including institutional challenges, labor issues, and immigration issues, to listen to the views of experts and civil society who are well versed with the situation on the ground. The biggest objective is to mitigate the negative impact that business conduct has on human rights. But SPF, as a Japanese foundation, also wishes to promote shared recognition of challenges and dialogue with stakeholders, including civil society and businesses between Southeast Asia and Japan, because we think that that will eventually lead to stronger partnership between Japan and Asia. By the way, we are planning to launch a new project dealing with this particular theme from next month. Under the pandemic, it's difficult to physically meet with each other or pursue joint research. So we've chosen the format of webinar, and in fact, at the outset, I myself experienced this technical glitch and caused much trouble to you, but I am sure and are hopeful that Japanese businesses are participating in this seminar. But under this new project, we will also be offering opportunities for engagement between Japanese businesses and local stakeholders. So you are cordially invited to participate in this new project as well. We truly hope that this webinar series will be useful to you, and particularly to your activities in Asia. With that, I would like to conclude my opening remarks. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Tsunami. We will now begin the webinar on preparing for the new reality, institutional mechanisms for addressing responsible business practices in Southeast Asia. This webinar will be moderated by Ms. Akiko Sato. Ms. Sato, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your warm welcome, Mr. Choi and Dr. Sunami. And thank you all for joining us today's webinar to preparing for the new reality, institutional mechanism for addressing responsible business practices in Southeast Asia. I'm Akiko Sato, the Deputy Secretary General of Human Rights Now, the Tokyo-based human rights NGO. I will be a moderator for today's session. So today, we have 4 distinguished panelists from the region. Since this is the first webinar of this series, we are aiming to set the scene for the entire theme, enhancing the responsible business in Southeast Asia. So each panelist will share their views on the role of institutions addressing the different dimensions to have a better understanding on existing, potential, and future challenges to enhancing institutional mechanism and coordination for responsible business practices. After the presentations, we'll have the panel discussion followed by the Q&A. So for the audience, if you have any questions, please put your questions to the Q&A box just shown at the bottom of your screen. And please specify to which panelist you'd like to pose your question and clarify your name and institutional affiliations. To save enough time for the discussion, I'd like to move on to the presentation part. To the panelists, as we are running a bit behind the schedule, so I appreciate if you keep your presentation within 10 minutes sharp. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Surya Deva for our first panelist. So Professor Surya Deva is an associate professor at the School of Law of City University of Hong Kong and a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So the Professor Deva will be talking about the role of states in promoting responsible business conduct in times of COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Akiko. Let me begin by congratulating the organizers of this webinar series for organizing these series of webinars on very important issue, and thank you for the invitation. So in this brief time, I would like to highlight two points. The first point is I would like to highlight how COVID has exposed that the current economic model is not really viable. And I will give some examples and indicators why it is not viable. And then in terms of the solution, secondly, I will try to highlight how this COVID crisis can be used as an opportunity to build back better in terms of responsible business conduct. But let me start with highlighting why this current economic model that we have, not just in Southeast Asia, but globally, is not viable. I will give 6 indicators or examples of this. The first, which is quite well documented now, is the level of inequalities. If we look around, the economic inequality is tremendous. An Oxfam report released earlier this year highlighted that the top 1% people in the world, the top richest people in the world, they have twice as much wealth as about 6.9 billion people. Now, this level of inequality is unsustainable. But we are not talking about merely economic inequalities. We also have digital inequalities, which are again exposed by the COVID crisis. Not everyone can work from home. Not everyone can learn from home because they may not have the tools. And I think that issue of digital divide is again exposed by COVID. My second example is that the idea of human dignity, that all of us have the same level of human dignity and human rights, is again exposed. Because the workers who are working hard in the factories, they may be working even 12 hours a day or 14 hours a day. And the chief executive officers of companies, they are not valued equally. So the workers are paid very tiny. And even if those minimum wages are paid, they are not living or sustainable wages. On the other hand, the chief executive officers and the leaders of the companies, they're making millions of dollars, even in this crisis time. So I think this creates this situation of unequal worth of different people in society. My third example is discrimination. Society has discrimination of various kinds, but COVID has also exposed these discriminations against whether these are women or persons of disability or older population. And I think this is something we need to reflect on very seriously. My fourth example is privatized healthcare. If people are suffering from either COVID or some other illness in this particular time of crisis, then in many cases, the government health facilities are not good enough, or they cannot take care of those everyone who needs those opportunities. And then if you go to the private sector health professionals, sometimes not everyone can afford them. That is the first situation. Or even if you can afford them, they could be corrupt practices in the private health system. And I think that is a matter of concern. My fifth example is over-reliance on global supply chains. When I was a child, I knew that the fruits and vegetables have seasons. So you don't get every fruit and every vegetable throughout the year. But because of the globally interconnected economy and supply chains, you can get fruits and vegetables throughout the year. Is this sustainable? Because these supply chains have been disrupted, and I think this is a question we should be asking. My last example is about excessive and unnecessary travel, including myself. We have been traveling to these conferences and events, and I think we should be asking this question in post-COVID time, that can we cut down on the travel and make it more sustainable? So I gave these examples to highlight that the current economic model is not really viable, it is not inclusive, it is not sustainable, and it is not equitable. What is the solution then? I will suggest that states can use this crisis as an opportunity to promote responsible business conduct to build an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable economy. And the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provide a framework for all actors, including states and businesses, how this can be achieved. I think we should use this COVID crisis as a wake-up call, because it is quite possible that we might have different crises in future. We might have climate change, we might have automation, we might have forced migration as new waves of crisis. And that's why it is critical that we take this wake-up call seriously. Now, what steps can be taken by the states? I will again highlight very briefly a number of these steps, which are somehow linked with the 3 pillars of the UN Guiding Principles, but I will not make that connection explicit. I'm sure the participants and the audience can make those connections, but otherwise I will be happy to do so in the question and answer time. First of all, I think it is crucial to redefine the purpose of business in society. Businesses are here not merely to make profit or maximize profit. They have a social purpose, and that social purpose should be taken very seriously. And that's why the corporate laws have to be reoriented. That is my first point. Secondly, states have to ensure, by whatever means, whether it is mandatory human rights due diligence or other means, or providing incentives, but they have to ensure that all businesses respect all human rights. I will call this profit with principles. Making profit is nothing wrong with it. But if you make profit without following the human rights principles, this is highly problematic. And states all over the world, including Southeast Asia, have a responsibility to ensure that businesses make profit with principles. My third point is that the states have to lead by example. And what I mean here is that there are many state-owned enterprises in Southeast Asia, and the governments have to ensure that these state-owned enterprises respect human rights wherever they operate. Even if they're operating outside Asia, the governments have this obligation that these businesses do not violate human rights. My fourth point is about policy coherence. So when it comes to business and human rights or responsible business conduct, it is very critical that all the government departments are aware of this agenda. So we should not have a situation where a ministry which is pushing trade and investment is ignoring human rights or environmental considerations. So we should not have a situation where environmental impact assessment or labor laws are being diluted at the same time the government is promoting the UN Guiding Principles. My fifth point is that we have to revisit the current development model. The current development model is not benefiting everyone. It is only benefiting people on the top of the pyramid. And there is no trickle down which is effective. And that's why we need to build a development model which is inclusive, which is bottom up, and which is based on the needs of each and every person in society. Otherwise, this idea of leaving no one behind is merely a dream and false illusion. My next point is that the governments would have to ensure that the basic needs are fulfilled of everyone. And that is where the social security may become quite relevant in future. Even if we are able to overcome the current COVID crisis, the automation may force many people out of employment. And that's why the basic needs of each and every person must be met by the governments. Otherwise, we may have a situation where some people are likely to suffer in future as well. Now, let me conclude by making two more points. One is about access to justice and corporate accountability. It is absolutely vital that if there are businesses who are not doing well and who are not listening to the government incentives and disincentives, then there have to be sanctions. There have to be civil, criminal, and administrative penalties and fines, and accountability of irresponsible behavior and business actors is absolutely vital. Otherwise, we have a space for free riders. And my last point is that civil society organizations, human rights defenders, trade unions, and social movements have a critical role to play in this new development agenda. It is absolutely vital for states as well as businesses to understand that these actors or non-state actors are absolutely critical to ensure economic model which is inclusive and equitable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Surya, for your presentation. Thank you for the reminding that significant elements of responsible business, in particular highlighting the role of the states, including the state-owned enterprises, along with some relevant ideas. So the next speaker, I'd like to invite Professor Dato Aishah Bidin. She is a professor of corporate and insolvency law, the Faculty of Law, National University of Malaysia, and she is well known as a former commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, known as SAHAKAM. So she will be talking about the role of national human rights institutions in responsible business, the during and post COVID-19. So the Professor Aishah, could you please share your slides? And the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Akiko. And I also like to congratulate the organizer for hosting this webinar session. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the Yusof Isa Institute for inviting me to share some of my experience in terms of the role of the National Human Rights Institutions, especially in promoting responsible business during and post COVID-19. Now, first of all, I'd just like to mention, of course, this pandemic of COVID-19 has such a great implication on all nations. And one of the major issues arising from the implication is the effect on marginalized groups, on vulnerable groups and societies. So this is the part in which there is a role for the National Human Rights Institution to come in, because human rights standards and human rights principles are always referring to protecting, preserving national, preserving standards and protecting the marginalized group. In addition to that, there is also a linkage between human rights standards and SDGs, especially when you talk about during COVID-19, the health rights, health matters. So SDG 3, SDG 16, and SDG 17 would be very relevant in this situation. When I actually view the situation of the role NHRI, I also refer to the context of Malaysia, because as in other states, the control order, movement control order, the conditional movement control order was also being implemented by the government. And as a result, there are major implications on various sectors in the industry and also the other groups. There are also economic stimulus measures being launched by the government. And in Malaysia, of course, there is the Prihatin Rakyat, for the protection of small medium enterprises and the micro businesses, which altogether amounted to about 260 million. There is also a new law, and I believe this is also being done in other countries like Singapore. Malaysia passed just last month in August 2020, temporary measures for reducing the impact of coronavirus disease 2019. And as a result of that, modification were made to 16 other legislations. So by looking at this particular what has happened in the last few months, where does human rights come in? Where does NHRI comes in? The way we see it is that the human rights provide a framework for analyzing and for mitigation trade-off, because in this situation, we would be able to get a position where there is a need for emergency and securities measure here to be implemented or launched by the government, and that surely can be done. But however, it must be done in accordance with human rights law, human rights principle, which stressed on equality, non-discrimination. It must be proportionate, temporary, and be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. And of course, for guiding principle can be considered as a cornerstone for sustainable development in order to provide as protective measures. In addition to that, before I go to the role of NHRI during and post-COVID-19, the role and function of NHRI is already there that puts NHRI in the right position, to tackle the situation. First, why is that so? First, NHRI are independent body, right? So as independent body, they are tasked with promoting and protecting international human rights law at a domestic level. Number two, of course, applying the UNGP guiding principle, they would apply the first pillar and the second pillar, where collaboration between NHRI and state institution is very important for the duty of the state to protect human rights. And the second pillar, where the responsible of the corporate to respect business and human rights. So in this sense, we can see that NHRI is in the right position as the only state-based non-judicial mechanism with mandate which are expressed in explicit human rights terms that are capable of responding to systematic issues in situation of emergency situation like the COVID-19. Now, in addition, in furtherance to the existing powers conferred to NHRI, another area where NHRI can contribute to the scenario is the effect on assessing to remedy, because as NHRI, they have that role and function to receive complaints, to handle complaint handling mandates. So this is also very important in times of crisis, as of course this mandate is provided for under the Paris Principle. NHRI can actually conduct investigations and public inquiries. This is also another valuable mechanism in which they can actually utilize this role and function during the situation. They can also conduct watching brief, issue recommendations, and one of the other aspect is in terms of the advocacy role in providing platforms such to promote human rights like education and training. Right, so these are the other roles of NHRI as well. Of course, in time where there are certain issues between the different levels of stakeholder, NHRI can conduct mediation. Yeah. So I would go to the situation during COVID-19. Now, this is the part in which, based on the powers that was given to the NHRI, we can sense that they can play more effectively in terms of assisting the state in providing the strategies, economic measures, and so forth. Now, the first role that NHRI can play during situations of COVID-19 is that NHRI can encourage to mobilize a diverse range of civil society actors. Now, of course, it must be done in a manner consistent with inclusivity, participation, and non-discrimination. For example, NHRI can always mobilize and integrate women human rights defenders and organizations that represent those who are most at risk of marginalization and social engagement that forms part of health measures. Now, this will apply to groups such as the migrants, racials, ethnic minorities, older persons with disabilities, and so forth. And the fact that because all NHRI would normally act as a conduit, will act as a conduit with the government, and they will represent the views and challenges of the civil society and the marginalized group to the government. So this is very important. In addition to that, NHRI can also participate in the preparedness for COVID-19. So how do they play this role? By the independent mandate given to NHRI, they can actually integrate their function and activities in related public health mechanism at national and local level as appropriate. Now, this is the part in which the state, the government can work together with NHRIs to coordinate the work at relevant agencies such as social services, education, law enforcement. Most importantly is to support the health action and to address impact of related measures. Is also very important is access to information that facilitate participation. Now, access to information in this sense is the role of NHRI to monitor and assist in the dissemination of accurate and evidence-based information. Now, especially the role in terms of monitoring, monitoring information and spreading facts and information to the relevant parties. There's also another aspect of information is access to information that also facilitate participation. Now, this would mean NHRI can play a role in allowing certain quarters group to participate in meaningful decision making and establish mechanisms that enable consultations, feedback, and complaint. So this is very important during COVID-19 because we can see, especially for those affected group which are who are living in remote areas, who are not equipped with facilities and so forth. Now, this is the role where NHRI can facilitate their participation. NHRI can also establish forum for participation where feasible and participatory mechanism should give special attention to groups and individuals at risk of being left behind, especially for those who require urgent attention. Now, apart from that, NHRI can also, very important, is to provide or carry out analysis and monitoring, especially in relation to outbreak that has happened in the country, and also promoting health measures, taking into consideration gender aspect and civil, political, and economic, social, and cultural rights. Another important aspect of the function of the role of NHRI is that NHRI can also bring attention to gender-specific risks, such as potentially greater exposure to infection, gender-based violence, and most importantly, inequality between women and men, because we normally heard the fact that because there is a lockdown, it seems there is also an increase of abuses, among husband and wife. So it seems that so this is also a consequence of COVID-19. The fact that NHRI has always an important role in identifying risks by persons deprived of their liberty and advocating for mitigation measures. And in this case, certainly we are talking about who are being deprived of their liberties, such as migrants, refugee camps, and so forth. So the concept of leaving no one behind is certainly very strategic that can be adopted by NHRI in their actions and activities during that time. Now, what about during post-COVID-19? Does NHRI still be able to play their part in collaborating with the state to formulate or participate in strategies or economic strategies and so forth. I think within that context, NHRI can still continue to engage in response to COVID-19 to the extent that their mandate allows them, especially to participate in terms of coordination with national health emergency management mechanism and so forth. NHRI can also provide constructive advice on the legal framework related to aspects of fundamental rights, for instance, freedom of movement, expression, assembly, and association, including limitations for those who suffered during the quarantine period. As protection of human rights is also one of the mandate of national human rights institution. So post-COVID-19 is also a very strategic opportunity for NHRI to continue to promote access to good and healthy quality healthcare and services. And in addition, of course, to continue the advocacy role, advocating for basic needs like food, water, shelter, sanitation, and so forth. As far as the duty of businesses to respect human rights, this is the part in which NHRI can actually continue to implement the second pillar towards the businesses to respect human rights. Now, how does they do that? Because businesses can play a part in terms of promoting occupational health and safety. So certainly in situations where there is a need of adequate facilities, medical and personal protection equipment and so forth, this is the part in which we would expect businesses and enterprise to assist and facilitate those who are in need. NHRI can also advise on mitigating measures to avoid the spread of the virus in confined places. This could include advocacy for compliance with international standards related to deprivation of liberty, including those in immigration detention facilities, those who are homeless, at home settlements, and so forth. Monitoring the impact can also be one of the functions that NHRI would still continue even during post-COVID-19. But what is important as well, I think, NHRI during this very time of challenges is to address the stigma and discrimination, racism, and incitement to violence. And this can be done through the platform of awareness raising campaigns. Finally, going forward, I have to say that the COVID-19 is a particular situation that has affected all business of any sizes. And of course, there are major consequences on that. There are great challenges for business enterprise. There are great consequential implications on every sectors of the societies, what more the marginalized group. Within this context, national institutions can actually contribute a very important role by integrating their mandate and activities to make a contribution. What kind of contribution? One, advocacy. Two, by monitoring and investigation, the handling of complaints, by giving legal assistance, by giving advice to the government, and also by supporting human rights defenders. But it is very important, the cardinal rule is that all these recovery strategies and preventive measures must be implemented without discrimination of any kind. And there must be an emphasis of transparency and information sharing. Finally, I would also like to stress the cooperation and global partnership is very important, which actually allows that nobody should be left behind. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Aishah, for your presentation. What you have highlighted in terms of the role of national human rights institution is, I think, very much connected to access to justice and the role of the human rights defenders, which the Professor Surya also mentioned. And I also believe that it's really crucial to consider how we can achieve Build Back Better. That's through the work of National Human Rights Institution, along with the cooperation among states and other actors, as Mr. Choi just mentioned during his opening remarks. So thank you very much. So I'd like to invite the presenter, Professor Zhang Wanhong. The Professor Zhang Wanhong is from Wuhan University School of Law, and he's also an executive director of Wuhan University Institute for Human Rights Studies. And he's also director of Wuhan University Public Interest and Development Law Institute. So his topic will be about business and human rights in China before and after COVID-19. So I'd like to welcome the Professor Wanhong. So the floor is yours.
Can you hear me, and can you also see my screen sharing?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Very
yeah, thank you, Akiko, and thanks to our colleagues and friends to share their opinions. I want to also thank ISEAS. I hope can visit Singapore soon as we planned. And for the Sasakawa Foundation, I want also have one sentence to say that when I was a PhD student, I got a scholarship from Sasakawa Foundation to support my one-year study at the Hopkins 19th Center. So thank you. My background, I delivered a lecture last year at ISEAS. At that time, I talk about on the disability rights, but another field of my research is business and human rights. In the last few years, I focused on the human rights impact of China's overseas investment. I and my colleagues promote the teaching and the curriculum development of business and human rights in China's law schools and business schools, and we just finished the first case and the materials textbook on that topic in Chinese. Today, I will talk about the three questions. Actually, these points were asked by the organizer and the moderator. I will try my best to answer it. The first is the human rights risks and issues in China during the time of COVID-19, and the second is the steps of companies and private sector take on to manage human rights risks. The third is the country's government approach to this responsible business. Okay, for the first aspect of human rights risk and issues in China and during the COVID-19, the first one I want to share is the surveillance and the abuse of personal data in ICT sector. Before that, I want to make it clear that I really appreciate the great efforts the Chinese government and the Chinese companies they made to control the pandemic, and it's a great success. But there are some minor some problems in that. It's an open secret that the mass surveillance infrastructure in China and private companies hand over sensitive data to authorities from time to time. But COVID-19 made it justified. When I say justified, it means that the COVID-19 gave the government a chance or excuse to gather, to integrate the data across different departments and systems. But before the COVID-19, only comparatively higher level authorities can access the data. Now the lower level authorities can access the data too. A lot of bad practice were given green lights in the name of a public health emergency. There are two stages or two kinds of surveillance. First, it believes that at the early stage of the outbreak of COVID-19, intensive coronavirus-related censorship contributed to the spread of the virus and the public inability to protect themselves. People don't know what happened, and they expose themselves to the dangerous situation. The second is the abuse of phone GPS location data. Here on the screen, you can see they call the health code, or a lot of time we say the green code. The pandemic tracking apps are now widely used as a local government have started trying to gain access to phone GPS location data. When you want to get into the department store, you want to get at the restaurant, you want to get the train station, the airport, you need to show your green code on your cell phone. And they track your location automatically. They can know where you are. Have you been to the so-called high risk region? The color can change automatically. So I don't know the how they generate the code. For the green code you can access. You have a yellow code on your cell phone, you'll be forced to isolate yourself for 7 days. And if your code are red, basically you cannot move anywhere. You need to be isolated yourself or sent to hospitals, other places for 14 days. So that's this is the first issue I want to share. But when I say this, I feel that it's not an easy question to handle. This kind of the code system is believed that effective, and the general public accept it, and I should say sometimes appreciate. There's no strong tradition of privacy in China. Professor Surya Deva may know that in recent days in Hong Kong, the the public are asked to do the virus test. And some people concerned about their kind of the DNA can be collected or the other biological data can be collected. But there's no such concerns, no such kind of debate or no such kind of discussion in mainland China when we do that. So that's we are in the on one hand is the effectiveness, another hand is the personal privacy. So it's not an easy question to handle to balance. But I just say that there's a fact that the data are collecting and analysis now in China. Okay, the second thing is I will discuss that in the manufacturing, especially on the garment sector. Just a few background is that China is the world's biggest exporter of textile and garments, employing over 15 million people, the majority of whom are women and also migrant workers. China is the largest supplier of apparel to United States and also a major supplier to the EU. That's a basic background. There's several impacts of the pandemic to the garment sector. Millions of workers in the garment industries are losing their job as the COVID-19 crisis and the US-China trade war caused the closure of factories in China export-oriented manufacturing industry. And their wages and the social insurance, this kind of was heavily influenced. A lot of workers in those sectors, in those industry, responded their wages had decreased. And we also have some cases that shows that the kind of forced labor, the garment workers not paid the salaries. Those are violations or abuse of human rights happened during these days. And so for the demands from local unions and civil society groups, I want to say that the garment workers in the supply chains, the trade unions try to voice out for them, and as a requirement of the responsible business practice, and ask the factories to protect them, to give them a decent salary or basic life support during this crisis. Okay, another aspect is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Chinese overseas projects and workers. I do not have many first-hand data so far, but I just signed the agreement yesterday with Phoenix TV based in Hong Kong. I will do a survey together with a team in Myanmar for them on the impact of COVID-19 on the Chinese business in Myanmar. If I come back next month, I can report you with fresh data. But here you can see on the screen that a lot of stories are reported and happening in different countries, in Tajikistan, in India, in Vietnam, in Cambodia. The workers are how say the protesting, demanding to be allowed to travel, and some workers in the Chinese government footwear companies, they protest to demand unpaid wages, and some other issues you can read. Another thing I want to mention is the other sectors. For example, the healthcare sector. According to the China WHO joint investigation group, they found that there are over 3,000 medical staff that infected by the virus, and 22 died. Now it's that the pandemic in China generally is under control, but the situation for the medical staff, for the nurses and the doctors are still have a very difficult situation. Some are kind of overworked, and they did not have a kind of enough protection devices or to protect themselves. These are, we can see the pictures at in the high peak of this pandemic. They just sleep on the floor, and they do not have a how say the adequate situation. But we highly praise their sacrifice and their efforts, but it is a fact that their kind of rights cannot be fully protected during those times. Here is a respectable media in China, the Southern Weekend. They did an investigation, and they produced a report recently to show that the lack of CSR during the academic. For example, the false advisement, some liquor industry, liquor factory says that you drink the alcohol can prevent yourself from infection of the virus, and some companies, some supermarkets raise the price of the during the academic. And some hospitals, they try to abuse the donation from the general public. Those kind of different things like investigated and exposed in the last few months. The second point about the steps of companies and private sector take on to manage human risks, I just give 2 points. The first one is according to the Financial Times report, that the Hong Kong and New York listed technical companies are sensitive to any accusation that they are lax with data security. I use this example to show that at least the capital market, the ESG regulations have an influence on the Chinese companies if they are listed in the listed company. They are in Hong Kong or New York listed. So they try to, when they face this accusation, they try to defend themselves. This kind of requirement, this kind of regulations can give them a certain pressure or to adjust their practice. The second example, second point is I found that there's a joint statement by the Sustainable Textile and of the Asian region, the STAR. They try to promote the good practice, and the Chinese companies they echo, they follow this statement. This kind of private sector, the voluntary rules can produce some positive outcome in this regard. Lastly, for the country or government approach, basically the government itself must follow due diligence process and identify human rights risks and impacts during emergency and other normal time too. But my concern, my personal view is that the government, especially Chinese government, are much powerful than the private sectors. And there's a lack of opponent, no matter from civil society or governments and Western groups or international groups who balance the power or intervention. But here I show an example on the screen that the 200 plus CSOs send kind of letters or statement to the Chinese kind of entities or for the Chinese investment banks and to ask they are to the notice creating a mechanism for directing finance to better road projects that have been impacted by the COVID-19, stating the project that are highly quality, legally compliant, and have a controlled risk can qualify to receive COVID-19 related financial relief. This statement so far not got a response, got not feedback from the Chinese banks or other ministries. But I think there's some possibilities to push Chinese government actively regulating its Chinese overseas investment towards responsible and meeting the needs of host communities. While there has no evidence that the Chinese government or main actors such as policy banks would respond to those statements from civil society, as far as we know, relative government departments and banks already received the letters from different channels, and that will form pressure points in the future. And lastly, there are some final thoughts. When I say that's a semi-final thoughts, maybe I mean that it's open for discussion. And I will keep thinking on that. That's just the temporary preliminary fundings. Firstly, is the business and human rights that was heavily influenced by the pandemic. The problems, the flaws of the business and human rights were fully exposed in the pandemic. If we didn't do enough in the so-called normal times, this pandemic magnified it. We can find that the gaps in this pandemic very clearly. Secondly, some groups, human rights, just as the previous distinguished speakers point out, some groups, human rights, were more seriously harmed. For example, the women or migrant workers, persons with disabilities. These are vulnerable groups or marginalized groups. Their rights, human rights, were more seriously harmed. The third one is that they are opportunities in crisis to promote business human rights in this crisis. In the Chinese word, the 危机, the crisis means danger and also opportunities. We later I can in the QA and section I can share more practice and good examples we did to promote the business human rights during this pandemic. But we can use this opportunity to high profile to promote this idea of responsible business to show the necessary the effects should be taken to promote the human rights in the crisis and the so-called normal times. And lastly, there's the urgent need to develop, actually a consensus or protocol for business and human rights under public health crisis. We didn't fully prepared. When the COVID-19 this kind of outbreak in Wuhan and in other places, we don't know how to do for the business sectors, for the regulatory agencies. None of them have fully prepared. But under this situation, we should think about it, how to develop a protocol standards or to say in the future, if we have a similar crisis, maybe we can do better. This is there's an urgent need to develop those consensus and protocols. Okay, that's all I want to say so far. Thank you very much. Thank you, Akiko.
Thank you, the Professor Wanhong, for your presentation. And thank you for elaborating some very important issues, specifically relevant to the pandemic. I also, it's very intriguing to know that how the ESG idea that has been displayed to the private sector in China with some difficulties. And I'd like to know more about how the good practice that can be achieved through business and human rights lens. So before going to the last panelist, I'd like to announce to the audience that the webinar will be extended by another 10 minutes, so that it will end around the 11:10 in Singapore time. So sorry for thank you for your patience. So I'd like to invite the last but not least, the first speaker, the Dr. Selena Rahman. Dr. Rahman is a visiting fellow under the Malaysia Studies program at the ISEAS. And her research interests lie in rural and coastal community attitudes and behavior with regards to religion and ritual, politics, natural habitat use, and urbanization. So her topic will be the role of the roundtable of sustainable palm oil in Malaysia and Indonesia. So Dr. Serina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Akiko. Good morning. I need to share slides. Hang on a sec. Okay, so today this topic is the RSPO, which is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And I'll do a bit of a discussion on issues in Malaysia and Indonesia. So before we do that, this is the overview of what I will speak about. But I'd like to thank the Sasaki Foundation and ISEAS-SPF for inviting me to give this speech, but also to Ben Low, who did the invitation, and to Dr. Lipo On, who is my partner in our research on oil palm in Sabah. So a lot of this information is actually taken from that research that we're doing over there, or we were doing before the virus. So we start with, very quickly, give you an introduction to oil palm in these two countries. Malaysia and Indonesia are the top producers of oil palm in the world. So together, they produce 85 to 90% of global oil palm exports. And this comes up to many million tons and uses up many hectares of land in both countries. What is interesting to note in this list is that out of RSPO certified production, in Malaysia, 42% is certified under RSPO, and Indonesia it is 51%. However, if you go through the net and you look for comments on how unsustainable oil palm is in these two countries, then in Malaysia you have a figure from the Malaysian Palm Oil Board. So that is the government agency for oil palm, so clearly it will have a bias. It states that only 3.96% of oil palm estates are not certified either under MPOB, or under RSPO. According to Mongabe, however, which is an environmental website, they say that 81% of oil palm in Indonesia is not sustainable. But again, we need to take both of these figures with a pinch of salt, because one is the government mouthpiece, the government agency, and the other is an environmental website. So their figures and their comments will always be a bit more to the negative side. But this gives you an idea of the disputes that we have between whether oil palm is sustainable or not. And I go into that a little bit more later. So what are the general oil palm issues? I think this is quite, most people are quite aware of this, so I'm just going to run through it very quickly. Basically, there is a global campaign against oil palm, and in response to that, people in Southeast Asia claim that it is a colonial conspiracy. It is an effort to promote European or American soy, rapeseed, and sunflower in contrast to oil palm, given that oil palm is largely produced in Southeast Asia and Africa. There are also issues of pollution in terms of the fertilizer and the land damage. But of course, responses are that, you know, the waste from oil palm can be converted into biogas, which will then reduce our use of fossil fuels. And of course, there's lots of scientific evidence of the health benefits of oil palm. The main issue against oil palm that is always cited is deforestation and loss of biodiversity. There are myriad campaigns using the orangutan as, you know, the main species that is losing its habitat. And there are questions on local laws, which are plentiful, on deforestation restrictions or limits to how much land can be used for oil palm plantations. Of course, all of this is said to be dubious in terms of enforcement, in terms of corruption, in terms of the fact that a lot of oil palm estates are very far away from main town centers, especially in a huge country like Indonesia. So none of this can actually be enforced or tracked. The other issue, of course, is open burning and the resultant transboundary haze. Plantations sometimes are created on peat swamps, which then means if there is open burning to clear land or to clear old trees, the fire burns unregulated and it spreads and it's very hard to put out. So this then causes problem for the entire region. When we're talking about marginalized communities, and this is also the focus of my work in Sabah, we are talking about issues of land grabbing, issues of lack of tenure, lack of land titles. FPIC means free and prior informed consent, which means that when big plantations come in and take up land for oil palm plantations, they do not necessarily get the approval of indigenous people who traditionally live on those lands. There are countless human rights issues. The photo that you see on the right or left, I'm not sure which way you see it, is of sacks of oil palm fruit. And this is a photo by Rita Rahim, who works with Orang Asli, which are the indigenous people in Peninsular Malaysia. Women are usually the ones who collect these. These are the ones that fall off when the men pull down the fresh fruit bunches. And the women are paid 350 ringgit per sack. That is just a little bit over $1 Singapore dollar. And so it is pittance, really. There have been countless reports of abuse of women, the use of illegal migrants, and of course, child labor. But of course, there is the counter argument that for smallholders, which we'll talk about a bit later, child labor is actually just family members who are helping on the land. So these are the questions that are always raised. We need to know also that in Malaysia and Indonesia, there are local oil palm authorities, but also local ways of certifying oil palm. So there is the MSPO and the ISPO. And the claim is that these local certifications are able to better adapt international standards to suit the local context. And most of these are taking into account issues and obstacles faced by smallholders. For the ISPO, they were improving various components of their certification system, but this has been delayed by the pandemic. So we go to smallholders. I'm speeding quite swiftly along because we're running out of time, but also because it is more important to talk about the COVID impacts. In Malaysia, smallholders are those who have land of less than 40 hectares. This is about 17% of the total oil palm ownership. And then some smallholders are independent, that's 17%, but there are also organized smallholders, which means that these smaller farms are organized under FELDA or FELCRA or other government agencies which group them together in a sort of cooperative. Indonesia has the same system. In Indonesia, the criteria for smallholding is less than 62 acres or 25 hectares. And it is estimated that this actually makes up about 40% of total oil palm acreage. So Indonesia also has a cooperative system, Credit Koperasi Prima Anggota, and this is estimated at taking about 700,000 to 900,000 hectares of the whole oil palm plantation. But what we need to understand from these figures is that no final figure is necessarily accurate. Maps of oil palm plantations are notoriously hard to come by. Some have been posted on the RSPO website now, but we find it very difficult to validate their accuracy. Small holdings especially are very difficult to pinpoint because some of them are planted on gazetted forest reserves on other people's land, so they will not declare these areas. So we never really know the actual acreage. So now we go to the RSPO, which is the main focus of this session. And so RSPO is an international organization. It's a roundtable format, which has representatives from many sectors within the oil palm industry. So it is upstream and downstream, those who market and reproduce oil palm into other products, as well as country representatives such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Africa, and the rest of the world. You also have civil society and environmental NGO representatives in the RSPO. This is an industry-led initiative. It is voluntary, and it is possible to be an RSPO member, but not necessarily be certified by the RSPO. So the goal of the RSPO is to make sustainable palm oil. And so they have the percentages that they've reached now, 19% of global oil palm production. And to be certified by RSPO, there are various levels of certification. So you can certify a miller, for example, or a plantation, or the ultimate goal is to certify the entire supply chain. And when you do that, you get a special trademark, and that then indicates that the product that you're using is using oil palm that is certified at all levels. The question put to me for this talk was, what was the response of RSPO to the virus, the global pandemic, and the issues that arose from it? If you look up RSPO and what they've been talking about since the virus, all they have mentioned is that auditing, which is done to ensure that oil palm remains certified, has moved to a virtual format. And the meetings, for example, for jurisdictional approaches and all of that have been put on hold. There is no discussion at all of assistance given to smallholders or anyone else. So what are the strengths and achievements of RSPO? Clearly, it is a commendable effort by the industry to ensure that their product is sustainable. It has a wide global network, it has huge support, it's got big industry members, which means there is financing and funding behind it. It has access to technical expertise. The idea is to provide this information to all levels within the oil palm industry, as well as to smallholders. They hold they have these academies where they run workshops for smallholders. They do try to get on the ground to reach out to people so that everybody is able to achieve certification. Especially for smallholders, RSPO has begun this jurisdictional approach to certification. And what this means is, because smallholders are very small, so they don't have economies of scale, the jurisdictional approach means that an area is certified as RSPO. And what this means is the smallholders are able to share resources, because in order to get certified, one, there is huge cost. Two, there are many technical and infrastructure requirements, and smallholders usually cannot afford this. With a jurisdictional approach, an area or region is able to submit itself for RSPO certification as a group, and so they can share some of these resources, and the RSPO can go down to this group as a whole and train them or provide them with the capacity building required to be certified. So that is, in essence, the RSPO's effort to reach out to those who are smaller and to help them achieve this certification. There are issues and weaknesses, though. Not everybody is aware of RSPO or understand the certification requirements. Surveys done by NGOs in Sabah, for example, where we did our work, reveal that many smallholders have no idea what RSPO certification is about. They understand they all have to be certified under local MSPO certification, otherwise they may not be allowed to sell their produce, but they have no idea what RSPO is. Also because the language and the level of technicalities that is required in certification is far beyond them. It's very difficult for them to understand and achieve. There are also countless accusations of greenwashing for the RSPO because it is an industry-led effort. And so environmental groups, for example, accuse it of mainly, meeting the needs of the big businesses and for them to actually cover up issues on the ground. There have been many reports of open burning, of land grabbing that the RSPO has not been able to counter or solve. Some environmental groups have pinpointed areas of open burning that comes from RSPO members. There is even RSPO itself has often a lot of tension with the local certifying agency. Between them, sometimes we hear of territorial disputes, like this is my area, this is not your area, none of your business. But there is also conflict in terms of how accurate, how useful, how achievable both certification standards are. So even in reaching out to plantations within a country, the RSPO will have to find a way to work with the local authorities and be accepted by the local authorities. On the ground, the general assumption is that a plantation or a smallholder works to get the local authority certification first, whether it's MSP or ISPO, and then they look towards RSPO because it's just too expensive or difficult to achieve. I mentioned that in the list here, that there are high costs. And of course, the larger businesses, the millers, the refineries, they are able to achieve RSPO standards. There is also more recently, more publications, actually a 2020 publication that talks about how the RSPO is an extension of colonial practices where the global north is imposing its standards and requirements on the global south, and therefore restricting the trade that is able to come from the south to the west and north, because the standards and the benchmarks that are created are actually based on Western norms and standards and benchmarks. So the local certification schemes are actually better suited to the local plantation industries because there is less requirement in the south or with their main trading partners. For example, Malaysia exports most of its oil palm to China and India, and these two nations are not necessarily as concerned with RSPO certification. So if those plantations had local certification, that's good enough. And so for the plantation owners, this is a neat way to sort of meet sustainability requirements, not have to come out with so much cost, and still get their exports bought. So what happened before the virus hit the world? There was actually some sustainability progress in both Malaysia and Indonesia. So under the Pakatan Harapan government, which was in power just before the pandemic hit, there was a national goal to make sure that everybody was certified under the MSPO. And this was launched by Theresa Kwok. It was a huge move to ensure that oil palm in Malaysia would be declared sustainable and acceptable to the world. Sabah and Johor have put in place jurisdictional approaches. So they are working in various parts of these two states to be certified under RSPO. So it is trying to meet both of these requirements. Also under the Pakatan Harapan government, before the pandemic, there was federal government vocalization to protect indigenous people rights. So in Kelantan, a northern state, for example, there was some dispute over land rights. An oil palm company was involved, and the federal government decided that the indigenous people had rights to the land. However, now that it is a different government in place, which came in just before the pandemic hit, and then everything also went on hold because of the pandemic, while we still have the national goals of achieving 100% MSPO, because this new government is also maintaining its environmental goals, we are not so sure how much of the indigenous people's rights will continue to be protected. Also underlying that is the fact that in Malaysia, land use and decision-making is under state government purview. So the federal government can say a lot of things about oil palm requirements and indigenous rights, but at the end of the day, it is really up to the state to decide. In Indonesia, they were updating their ISPO standard, which is what I mentioned earlier, and they were going to focus specifically on smallholders to ensure that they were all certified and to ensure that they had more support for higher yields, like to give them the technical assistance that they needed, better seeds and all of that. And this then will translate into less land cleared because they would be able to produce more from less. Jokowi also made the promise of indigenous land rights and custodianships, but because of the multiple layers in Indonesia, given the decentralized system of governance, there were still a lot of issues to return land to indigenous people, and there were multiple maps that were used by various entities who were laying claim to this land, and this also slowed down the return of land to the people. There were also countless fire-free programs that had been put into place to prevent open burning on peatland. However, once the virus hit, the funding that was going towards those programs were redirected towards the pandemic, and so those funds slowed down or essentially disappeared. So what has happened in the oil palm industry in these two countries over the pandemic? And I'm sorry, but we've just had a big storm hit, so I'm not sure if you're hearing the rain in the background. The closed borders restricted trade. Prices have gone down. And once trade restrictions step in, then the country as a whole loses the economic benefit from oil palm. At a local level, this was even more harsh in terms of its impacts. The lower prices resulted in lower incomes to the people, and I focus specifically on smallholders and marginalized communities that depended on oil palm for a cash income. For a lot of smallholders and marginalized communities, they grow oil palm as a source of cash. So they also, most of them also do grow consumption crops. So they have something to eat, for example. But what happened in rural communities, some feedback I got from Orang Asli communities, the indigenous people, for example, was that because of the movement restriction orders, for example, in Malaysia, where you couldn't move more than 10 kilometers, what happened was people could not get access to the oil palm that was harvested, so the middlemen could not go in, and what that meant was the producers could not get cash. They could not buy medicine, they could not pay for diapers, they could not pay for things that they needed cash for that was, other than food. So some harvests were wasted and poverty increased. Smallholders, to begin with, are usually in the lowest bracket, and so their poverty deepened. Some of them gave up on oil palm and switched to subsistence farming because in Malaysia, for example, and Indonesia, it's a very long drawn out restriction orders. So now they have moved some of their effort and emphasis to cash crops. Therefore, oil palm production has also gone down. So I mentioned already that financial support for the peat fire prevention has been moved to the virus, and sustainability certification improvements have also been put on hold. In Malaysia, because there is a clampdown on migrant workers and the virus threat, although we now have an emphasis on the agroeconomy to rebuild Malaysia's economy, this is restricted because a lot of plantations depend on, to be honest, illegal migrant workers. And with migrant workers not being allowed to come in, especially from India, which is a recent announcement last night, this will affect the ability of the economy to rebound and depend on the agroeconomic benefits that are coming out. So in terms of solutions, this is my last slide. In terms of solutions, really what we need to do as a result of this pandemic is focus on the smallholders. I apologize, but the big businesses, the millers, the refineries, they usually have the financial backing to survive. Their focus, as Prof. Surya mentioned just now, would be on profits. We do need profit with heart. We do need big refineries, big suppliers to look at the smallholders in their supply chains and figure out how to help them, because these people are suffering now. In the past, where a woman would earn 350 ringgit a bag to collect the oil palm fruits, what would she earn now? Pittance, next to nothing. These people are suffering. They have no food. During the pandemic, many civil society groups were going in to send them rations and food, but how long would that last? The offers of the Prihatin and other government benefits, for example, are not necessarily accessible to rural communities and the indigenous people. So more focused at the government and agency level, and perhaps for these big businesses, is to look at the smaller parties within their supply chain and provide them with the assistance they need. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
And I would pose some brief questions to the old panelists by taking my opportunities, so that we can have the very small the discussion. So due to the time limitation, I'd like to ask all the panelists to answer the question within 1 minute, please, and so that we can finish around there in the 5 minutes. 5 minutes or so, yeah. So for Professor Surya, my question is that what the state and the corporate they should consider while they promote and conduct human rights due diligence, specifically during the pandemic, while reflecting the point that you stressed that we could use UN guiding principles as an opportunity. So Professor Surya, could you please share your idea on that?
Okay, so I think human rights due diligence is a very critical tool, and I think the governments should create incentives as well as disincentives. I think that is very crucial. Incentives for businesses, because some small businesses may not have the resources and the capacity and expertise, and I think that is where the governments can jump in and provide support. At the same time, there should be disincentives for businesses who are going to continue with the irresponsible business practices. And I think that is where the idea of mandatory human rights due diligence is becoming more and more relevant. And my last point in response to this question will be that access to remedy should be linked with the idea of human rights due diligence. It's not an empty vessel. Rather, if a company is not doing it properly, and there are negative consequences, those affected individuals and communities should be able to seek some remedies, whether it is compensation or it is some fine or administrative or criminal sanctions on the businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. for your clear idea on that. So the next, for the professor, Dr. Aishah, I will pick up the question from the floor. So if you know that any cases that filed to National Human Rights Institution during the COVID-19, please share them with us. And also if you have any idea that how the National Human Rights Institution can function even even better during the pandemic, please share your idea on that as well.
Okay, thank you, Akiko. As regards to recent cases received by the National Human Rights Institution, that one I'm not too sure whether they are directly linked with COVID-19, yeah, because this is just the last few months, and I'm no longer a Human Rights Commissioner there. But I have to tell you that cases related to termination of laborers, migrant workers, labor issue, industrial relation is actually considered to be some of the categories of business and human rights cases that the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia received so far. So irrespective of whether the COVID-19 is there or not, you know, issues relating to business and human rights, relating to migrant workers, the protection, the treatment given to them, is considered as part of the cases that actually been part of the complaint cases. But for the last few months, I wasn't really aware whether there is a direct cases on COVID-19. How do we go forward in this particular situation, especially when we hear now, I mean, the recent announcement is some of the workers from some countries are not allowed to come in, and there are also instructions where some workers are be sent back and so forth. This is the part in which I think it's actually a part of an implementation what that was done during an emergency situation. But as I mentioned just now, that whatever security measures that will be taken during an emergency time, it must be proportionate, right? It must not be discriminatory, right, for that particular matter. And we do understand, although the principle of human rights actually fight very strongly for the protection of marginalized group, But at the same time, the state must also be fair in terms of implementation, those emergency measures. So in this particular sense, I think that's the part where the NHRI can come in. It is never easy. Being a former commissioner, it is never easy. What more as far as migrant workers, because Malaysia has not acceded to the Convention on the Protection of Migrant Workers. But what I can be positive is the new law that was passed. Now this new law is temporary. It has a lifespan until December 2020. But what is interesting in the new law is that it allows a particular situation in relation to what you call as inability to perform contractual obligation. And one of the area that was covered is in terms of construction workers. So in time where they are being terminated, we can hear there are many cases where the retrenchment and so forth. Now, this particular provision in the Act will come as a savior in that sense if it's being implemented and applied by that party. Now, the new law also provides a mediation process, right, during the COVID-19. This is also very new. As to how it's going to be implemented, now this is not known yet because this is still very recent, the last few weeks. I would have hoped that in the mediation process, the principle of human rights, should be one of the areas that can be considered. So I have to say that, of course, sometimes the theoretical framework is ideal. We would expect implement principle of non-discriminatory, transparency, accountability, and so forth be prevailed. But there must be a balance. There must strike a balance in implementation for that particular. And this is the part in which NHRI should play their part. It is never easy, but the opportunity is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Aishah. It's also the Wanhong. Could you please share some positive practices from business and human rights perspective during the pandemic in China that you just briefly mentioned at your presentation? And please be brief, thank you.
Since I took a lot of time when I made the presentation, I just realized, I apologize. So I will very, very briefly. For the Chinese companies, they mobilized by the government and also encouraged by the civil society. They make a lot of donation and they to fulfill their corporate social responsibilities. That's very good practice. It's give them a kind of platform to fulfill their responsibility. And also, we see the partnership between the public and the private sectors in the pandemic control in the last few months. And also, I myself as a scholar also joined that. So it's kind of a public, private, and also the kind of think tank. Those scholars work together. Some good practice to help the also to disseminate the idea of anti-discrimination, also, and also to give support to those have-nots. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very encouraging. So Dr. Serina, could you please share your idea that how the certificate body can improve its function to address human rights risk of the small and medium-sized holders that you mentioned is how important they are under pandemic and overcoming the weakness that you pointed out?
Yes, I think RSPO actually, because it has such a huge global network, it really should leverage on its contacts with the big business, with the refineries, with the millers, and these people have funds available. And they should leverage on this to help the smallholders who perhaps are in the process of applying. I'm sure they would have their contacts on the ground, the NGOs that they work with on the ground, and every country has this, who are able to identify at least a percentage of the smallholders, the rural communities, like people who really far out and need help, and provide them with this assistance from the bigger companies. This then will actually make the oil palm industry feel more like a community that is helping each other. And I actually don't think it's all that difficult. So it would be great if RSPO could do that, if MSPO and ISPO and all the other oil palm organizations could do that, but really RSPO tapping on their global funds and network should be able to do this.
Thank you very much. I think it's really the culture to make sure that the global corporations that will be there to address the human rights risk or the human rights violation of the most vulnerable on the ground. So thank you for all the presenters for your great presentation and sharing your insights on the recent human rights during the pandemic. And thank you for the audience for being with us with your great patience there, and sorry for some inconvenience that may have. So there, I'd like to turn back the mic to the MC for the future notice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sato. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of this webinar. Please join us for the subsequent sessions and for this webinar series. There will be one every Wednesday scheduled at this time slot. Our final session will be on 7 October 2020. Next Wednesday, we will have a webinar on engaging Southeast Asia's labour force. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you a pleasant day.